The evening head count at Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary began at exactly 1800 hours, same as it had every day for the past 23 years. Warden Mitchell Hayes stood in the control room overlooking D Block, clipboard in hand, watching the corrections officers move down the tiers with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete and steel that made up this fortress in rural Pennsylvania. Hayes had seen thousands of head counts. They were routine, mundane, forgettable, until they weren't. Cell 47 on the third tier held Marcus Webb, a 31-year-old serving consecutive life sentences for armed robbery and murder. Webb had been transferred to Coldridge 8 months earlier, after 3 violent incidents at his previous facility. His file was thick with disciplinary reports, psychological evaluations that painted a picture of barely contained rage, and notes from guards who'd learned to approach his cell with caution. Officer Derek Thompson stopped outside cell 47. Through the reinforced glass window, he could see Webb sitting on his bunk, back against the wall, hands folded in his lap, unnaturally still. Thompson had worked D Block for 6 years and had developed an instinct for when something felt wrong. This felt wrong. Webb's cellmate, a 52-year-old named Raymond Costa serving time for drug trafficking, stood pressed against the far wall. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow. Thompson's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. In the control room, Hayes watched the scene unfold on the monitor. He'd been briefed on Webb that morning. The inmate had been involved in an altercation during breakfast. Nothing serious, just posturing with another prisoner over territory in the yard. Standard prison politics. Webb had been given a warning and sent back to his cell. The incident report sat on Hayes's desk, awaiting his signature. Thompson keyed his radio. The static crackled through the control room speakers. Control? This is Thompson on D Block 3rd tier. I need a supervisor at cell 47. Hayes pressed the transmit button. What's the situation, Thompson? Inmate Webb is non-responsive to commands. Something's off here. Hayes scanned the monitor. Webb hadn't moved. Costa remained frozen against the wall. The warden's jaw tightened. He'd run this facility without a major incident for 3 years. That record mattered to him more than he cared to admit. Stand by, Thompson. Keep visual contact. Hayes turned to Sergeant Paul Reeves, his second in command, a man who'd spent 18 years working his way up from corrections officer to his current position. Reeves was already moving toward the door. I'll handle it, Reeves said. Take Martinez with you, and Reeves by the book. Reeves nodded and disappeared down the corridor. Hayes watched on the monitors as the sergeant and officer Lisa Martinez made their way through the security checkpoint and onto D Block. The other inmates had noticed the commotion. Faces appeared at cell windows, voices echoed through the block, that particular tension that rippled through a prison population when they sensed something happening. Reeves reached Thompson's position. The 3 officers formed a triangle outside cell 47, their body language controlled, professional. Hayes increased the volume on the audio feed. Webb, Reeves called out. Stand up and face the wall, hands behind your back. No response. Webb's eyes were open, staring straight ahead at nothing. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths. Costa spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible through the steel door. He's been like this for 20 minutes. Won't talk. Won't move. Just sitting there. Reeves exchanged a glance with Thompson. They'd both seen inmates attempt psychological manipulation before, playing catatonic to get transferred to medical, to create chaos, to test the system. But something about Webb's stillness felt different. It felt deliberate. Webb, last warning, stand up now or we're coming in with restraints. The inmate's lips moved. The words came out flat, emotionless. I'm exactly where I need to be. Hayes felt his stomach tighten. That phrase, that tone, it wasn't defiance, it was certainty. Reeves, do not open that cell, Hayes ordered into the radio, but protocol demanded action. An inmate refusing direct orders during head count required intervention. Reeves made the decision that would alter everything that followed. Martinez, prepare for cell entry. Thompson, you're back up. Martinez pulled the restraints from her belt. Reeves positioned himself at the door control panel. His keycard hovered over the reader. In the control room, Hayes felt the weight of his authority pressing down. He could override Reeves, could order a full lockdown, could call for the tactical response team. But that would mean admitting he didn't trust his own sergeant to handle a single non-compliant inmate. It would mean paperwork, investigations, questions about his leadership. He made the choice that would haunt him. Proceed with caution. The electronic lock disengaged with a heavy click. The door began its slow mechanical slide open. 3 feet, 4 feet, enough space for Martinez to enter with Thompson providing cover. Webb moved. Not with the explosive violence they'd expected. Not with the rage his file promised. He moved with purpose, with precision, like a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed 100 times in his mind. His hand shot out toward Costa. For a split second, the officers thought he was attacking his cellmate. Then they saw what Webb pulled from behind Costa's back. A piece of metal sharpened to a point, wrapped in torn fabric at one end to form a handle. A shank, concealed perfectly, waiting. But Webb didn't thrust it toward the officers. He pivoted, his body a blur of practiced motion, and drove the weapon into the exposed electrical conduit running along the cell wall. The prison's ancient wiring, installed in the 1970s during the facility's original construction, had been flagged for replacement in maintenance reports for 3 years. Budget constraints had pushed the project back repeatedly. The metal pierced through deteriorated insulation and made contact with live current. The spark was instantaneous. Blue-white light filled the cell. The circuit breaker should have tripped immediately. It didn't. The failsafe, corroded and weakened by decades of moisture and neglect, held just long enough for the current to jump from the conduit to the metal bed frame Webb had been sitting on. He'd soaked his mattress with water from the cell toilet over the past hour, while Costa watched in terrified silence. The fabric was saturated, conductive, a perfect accelerant for what came next. The electrical fire spread across the mattress in seconds. Synthetic materials purchased from the lowest bidder ignited with chemical intensity. Black smoke poured from the cell. The smell hit the officers first, acrid and choking. Martinez stumbled backward, her training kicking in. Thompson grabbed her shoulder, pulling her away from the doorway. Reeves slammed his palm against the emergency close button. The cell door didn't move. The electrical surge had fried the motor control system. The door remained open, smoke billowing out into D-block like a signal fire. Hayes watched from the control room as his facility began to unravel. He reached for the facility-wide intercom, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "All units, this is Warden Hayes. We have a fire in D-block, cell 47. Initiate emergency protocols. Fire suppression team to D-block immediately." His voice carried through every speaker in Coldridge. Calm, authoritative, in control. He turned to the duty officer manning the communications station. "Get the fire department on the line. Then call the state corrections department. Tell them we have a contained situation." The duty officer's fingers flew across the keyboard, but his eyes kept darting to the monitors. The smoke in D-block was spreading faster than it should. The ventilation system, designed to circulate air through the facility, was now distributing toxic fumes throughout the entire cell block. On the third tier, Reeves made the tactical decision to evacuate Costa from the burning cell. Thompson and Martinez formed a human shield as the terrified inmate scrambled out, coughing violently. They moved him down the tier toward the security door, away from the flames. Webb remained inside. Through the smoke, Reeves could see him standing in the center of the cell, arms outstretched, face tilted upward. The fire had engulfed the bunk and was climbing the walls, feeding on the layers of paint and the acoustic tiles in the ceiling. The heat was becoming unbearable. "Webb, exit the cell now." The inmate didn't move. His lips were moving, forming words Reeves couldn't hear over the roar of flames and the alarm klaxons that had begun wailing throughout the facility. The other inmates in D-block had gone from curious to panicked. Faces pressed against cell windows, fists pounded on doors. Voices screamed for release, for help, for someone to acknowledge that they were trapped in steel boxes, while smoke filled the air they breathed. Reeves knew he had seconds to make a choice. Enter the burning cell and attempt to extract Webb by force, risking his own life and potentially creating a hostage situation in the chaos, or seal off the tier and focus on protecting the other inmates. He chose the living over the willing dead. "Fall back! Seal the tier!" The 3 officers retreated to the security door. Martinez's hands shook as she swiped her keycard. The door remained locked. The electrical surge had cascaded through the block's security systems. Every electronically controlled door in D-block was frozen in its current state. The cells were locked, the security doors were locked, and cell 47 remained wide open, pumping smoke and fire into the enclosed space. In the control room, Hayes watched his worst nightmare materialize in real time. The fire suppression system for D block required manual activation from within the block itself. The automated systems had been disabled during a maintenance cycle and never properly restored. Another cost-saving measure. Another item on a list of deferred repairs. He grabbed the radio. All D block personnel, evacuate to the main corridor. Fire team, you're going in with full gear and manual override keys. The response crackled back within seconds. Warden, fire team is gearing up. Estimate 3 minutes to entry. 3 minutes. Hayes looked at the monitors. The smoke had reduced visibility to near zero on the third tier. The second and first tiers were filling rapidly. 53 inmates locked in their cells, breathing toxic fumes. 3 officers trapped on the wrong side of a security door that wouldn't open. He turned to his communications officer. Get me the master override codes for D block, now. Sir, those codes are in the secure vault. It'll take time to retrieve them. Hayes felt the first crack in his composure. Time was the one resource he didn't have. The fire in cell 47 had found the ceiling tiles. The acoustic material, installed decades ago when asbestos regulations were different, contained just enough organic material to burn hot and fast. Flames spread across the ceiling, following the tile grid like a road map. Within 90 seconds, the fire had reached the adjacent cells. The inmates inside those cells had no way out. They screamed, they pounded. They watched through their small windows as orange light danced across the tier walkway. Cell 48 housed 2 men, James Porter, serving 12 years for assault, and Kevin Liu, a 24-year-old gang member 6 years into a 20-year sentence. They stood together at their cell door, kicking at the reinforced steel, their voices joining the chorus of panic that filled D block. The heat built rapidly. The temperature in the enclosed tier rose degree by degree. Sweat poured down faces. Breathing became labored. The smoke was everywhere now, a living thing that moved through the block with malevolent purpose. Officer Thompson pulled off his radio and held it against his face, trying to filter the air. Martinez had her shirt pulled up over her nose and mouth. Reeves stood at the security door, slamming his shoulder against it repeatedly, knowing it was futile, needing to do something. Hayes made the call he'd sworn he'd never make. Break the door. Use whatever you have to. Get those men out of there. On D block, Reeves heard the order. He looked around the tier, searching for anything that could serve as a battering ram. The facility had been designed specifically to prevent inmates from accessing such tools. That same design now trapped his officers. The fire reached cell 49. Then cell 46. The flames moved with purpose, spreading in both directions along the tier. The ceiling tiles collapsed in sections, raining burning debris onto the walkway. The metal railings grew hot to the touch. In cell 47, Marcus Webb finally collapsed. The smoke inhalation and heat overwhelmed even his determination to remain standing. He fell to the floor, consciousness fading, a smile frozen on his soot-covered face. He'd done exactly what he'd intended to do. The warden's voice had said he was under control. 10 minutes had passed since those words left Hayes's lips, and now D block was burning. Officers were trapped, and 53 inmates were locked in their cells with nowhere to go. The fire department would arrive in 12 minutes. The tactical response team would breach the security doors in 15. The smoke would overcome the first victim in 8. Hayes stood in the control room, watching his career burn along with the cell block, and realized that control had been an illusion all along. The smoke detectors throughout Coldridge had been screaming for 90 seconds. In the central monitoring station, the fire alarm panel lit up like a Christmas tree, each red light representing a zone in distress. D block's entire third tier was compromised. The second tier indicators flickered from green to yellow to red as sensors detected the descending smoke. Hayes grabbed the facility phone and dialed the emergency line to the State Corrections Oversight Division. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. "This is Warden Mitchell Hayes at Coldridge Maximum Security. We have a critical incident in progress. Structure fire in D block with multiple personnel and inmates at risk. I'm requesting immediate state support and authorization for emergency breach protocols." The voice on the other end remained calm, trained for exactly this scenario. "Warden Hayes, what is your current containment status?" "Deteriorating rapidly. Fire originated in a single cell but has spread to the tier ceiling. Electronic security systems are compromised. I have 3 officers trapped on the third tier with no viable exit route. 53 inmates are locked in their cells. There was a pause. Hayes could hear typing in the background. "Warden, have you initiated full facility lockdown?" "Affirmative. All blocks except D are secure, but I need authorization to use explosive breaching on the security doors if manual override fails." "Authorization granted. Document everything. State response team is being mobilized. ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Hayes set the phone down and looked at the monitors. 45 minutes might as well be 45 hours. The fire team arrived at the D block entrance in full protective gear, carrying thermal imaging cameras, fire extinguishers, and the manual override keys that represented the last failsafe in a system that had catastrophically failed. Team leader Captain Frank Morrison had been with Coldridge for 14 years. He'd trained for this exact scenario in dozens of drills. None of those drills had prepared him for the reality. Through the reinforced window in the entrance door, Morrison could see the smoke. It moved like liquid, dark and heavy, pouring down from the upper tiers. The visibility was zero beyond the first few feet. Somewhere in that toxic cloud, his colleagues were trapped. Morrison keyed his radio. "Warden, fire team is at D block entrance, requesting permission to breach." Hayes didn't hesitate. "You have permission. Get my people out." Morrison inserted the manual override key into the entrance door panel. The mechanism was purely mechanical, designed to function even during total power failure. The key turned. The lock disengaged. The door swung open, and hell poured out. The smoke hit the fire team like a physical force. Morrison's thermal camera showed heat signatures throughout the block, the hottest point being the third tier, where cell 47 had become an inferno. He could see 3 figures near the tier security door, barely moving. "Team, we're going in. Standard search and rescue formation. Our priority is personnel extraction, then inmate safety. Nobody plays hero. We go in together, we come out together." The 4-member team entered D block. The heat was immediate and oppressive even through their protective gear. The smoke consumed their lights, turning the powerful beams into useless diffused glows. Morrison relied on his thermal camera and his memory of the block's layout. They moved toward the stairwell leading to the third tier. Each step took them deeper into the smoke, deeper into an environment that was actively trying to kill them. On the third tier, Reeves had made the decision that saved their lives. He'd ordered Thompson and Martinez to crawl, to stay below the smoke layer where breathable air still existed in small pockets. The 3 officers lay flat on the metal grating of the tier walkway, their faces pressed to the floor, drawing shallow breaths through whatever fabric they could hold against their mouths. Reeves's mind was still functioning, still calculating odds and outcomes. The fire had spread to at least 4 cells now. The heat from the metal walkway was becoming unbearable, even through his uniform pants. He estimated they had maybe 2 minutes before they'd be forced to choose between standing up into the smoke or lying on metal that would eventually cook them alive. The inmates in the cells were screaming themselves hoarse. The sound was primal, the sound of men who knew they were going to die and could do nothing but rage against it. Some had given up screaming and were simply pounding on their doors in rhythm, a death drum that echoed through the chaos. Cell 51 housed Anthony Briggs, a 47-year-old serving life for murder. Briggs had been in the system for 19 years. He'd seen riots, lockdowns, and violence that would break most civilians. But this was different. This was watching death approach with mathematical certainty and having absolutely no control over the outcome. He pressed his face to the small window in his cell door, trying to find clean air. There wasn't any. His lungs burned with each breath. His cellmate, Marcus Chen, had already collapsed on the floor, unconscious from smoke inhalation. Briggs made peace with dying. He stopped pounding. He stopped screaming. He sat down on his bunk, as far from the door as possible, closed his eyes, and waited. Morrison's team reached the base of the stairwell. The thermal camera showed the 3 officers on the third tier, their heat signatures growing fainter. They were running out of time. Double time up the stairs. "Watch for structural damage." The team climbed. The smoke was thicker here, a solid wall of toxic particulates that even their respirators struggled to filter. Morrison's visibility dropped to less than a foot. He climbed by feel, one hand on the railing, one hand holding the thermal camera in front of him like a talisman. They reached the third-tier landing. The security door was 10 feet away. Through the smoke, Morrison could barely make out the shapes of the 3 officers lying on the walkway. "Thompson, Reeves, sound off." A weak cough came from the nearest shape. Morrison moved forward, his team forming a protective line behind him. He reached Reeves first, grabbed the sergeant by his shoulder. "Can you walk?" Reeves nodded, though Morrison wasn't sure the man actually understood the question. The sergeant's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid. Classic smoke inhalation symptoms. "Turner, Jackson, get these officers out. Reynolds, you're with me. We need to get that security door open and assess the inmate situation." Two team members grabbed Reeves and Thompson, supporting their weight, and began the careful descent down the stairs. Morrison and Reynolds moved to the security door. The manual override keyhole was visible through the smoke. Morrison's hands were steady as he inserted the key. Nothing happened. He turned it again, applying more force. The mechanism was jammed. The electrical surge that had frozen the electronic locks had also damaged the mechanical backup system. The engineers who designed this facility had never anticipated a scenario where both systems would fail simultaneously. Morrison stepped back and assessed the door. Steel reinforced, designed to withstand significant force. Breaking it down wasn't an option with the tools they had. Explosive breaching would take time to set up and might trigger a structural collapse in the weakened tier. He keyed his radio. "Warden, third-tier security door is inoperable. Both electronic and manual systems are non-functional. We've extracted 3 officers, but we cannot access the inmates." In the control room, Hayes felt the situation slip further from his grasp. Without access to the third tier, the inmates in those cells were effectively sealed in a tomb. The fire was still spreading. The smoke was accumulating faster than the damaged ventilation system could handle. He made the call to the fire department, overriding protocol that required all coordination to flow through proper channels. "This is Warden Hayes at Coldridge. I need fire department assets here immediately. We have a structural fire with trapped civilians, multiple victims requiring immediate extraction." The dispatcher's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the severity. "Units are en route, Warden. ETA 4 minutes. Can you provide access to the affected area?" "Negative. The security doors are compromised. Your crews will need specialized cutting equipment to breach steel-reinforced barriers." "Understood. I'm upgrading this to a mass casualty event. Additional units are being dispatched." Hayes hung up and returned his attention to the monitors. The cameras in D Block were failing one by one as the heat damaged their circuits. The last functioning camera on the third tier showed nothing but smoke and the occasional flicker of orange flame. Cell 47 was no longer recognizable as a living space. The fire had consumed everything combustible. The walls were charred black, the ceiling had partially collapsed, and somewhere in that wreckage lay Marcus Webb's body, the architect of this disaster. The fire had jumped to cell 45 on one side and cell 48 on the other. The flames found fuel in the standardized furnishings every cell contained. Bunks, thin mattresses, the few personal items inmates were allowed to keep. Each cell became its own miniature inferno, contributing to the larger catastrophe. Officer Martinez had been carried out by the fire team. She sat in the main corridor outside D Block, an oxygen mask pressed to her face, her body shaking from adrenaline and shock. The paramedics who'd arrived from the prison medical unit checked her vitals while she stared at nothing, replaying the last 15 minutes in her mind. Thompson was in worse shape. He'd inhaled more smoke, been exposed to the heat longer. His skin was red with first-degree burns. His breathing came in ragged gasps, even with pure oxygen flowing into his lungs. The paramedics started an IV line, preparing him for transport to the nearest hospital once the situation stabilized enough to allow vehicles through. Reeves refused treatment. He pushed away the paramedics and staggered back toward the D Block entrance, where Morrison's team was regrouping and planning their next move. "I'm going back in," Reeves said, his voice raw and damaged. Morrison put a hand on his chest. "Sergeant, you're in no condition. You go back in there, you die. Simple as that. I've got 53 men locked in cells. I'm not leaving them. You don't have a choice. This is a fire department operation now. Your job is to provide intelligence, not attempt rescue." The sound of sirens penetrated the prison walls. The fire department was arriving in force. Hayes watched from the control room as multiple engine companies pulled through the facility gates. Firefighters in full turnout gear poured from the vehicles, moving with practiced efficiency toward the building entrance. Fire Chief Robert Daniels took command immediately. He found Hayes in the control room within minutes, demanding a full briefing. "Warden, I need your facility layout, current fire location, and exact number of personnel and inmates at risk." Hayes pulled up the digital blueprints on the main monitor. Fire originated here. Cell 47 on D block 3rd tier. We have 53 inmates locked in their cells, unable to evacuate due to electronic security failure. The manual override systems are also compromised. 3 officers were extracted with smoke inhalation injuries. The fire has spread to multiple cells and the tier ceiling structure. Daniel studied the layout with the eye of someone who'd seen hundreds of structure fires. This one was different. The security requirements that made prisons functional also made them death traps in emergencies. What's the door composition on those cells? Steel with reinforced frames, designed to prevent breaching from the inside, which means they'll also prevent breaching from the outside without specialized equipment. Warden, I need you to understand something. The moment we start cutting through those doors, we're introducing massive amounts of oxygen into a superheated environment. We could trigger a backdraft that kills everyone in that block. Hayes felt his throat constrict. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to suppress this fire before we can attempt any rescue. And even then, the thermal exposure those inmates have experienced. Daniels trailed off, leaving the grim implications unspoken. The chief turned to his incident commander. Get me a full hazmat team. I want thermal imaging on every cell. We need to identify which inmates are still viable for rescue and prioritize accordingly. And get the hydraulic cutters ready. We're going to need to cut our way through multiple barriers. The firefighters moved with purpose, hauling equipment into position. Hoses snaked through the corridors. Ventilation fans were set up to begin clearing the smoke, though their effectiveness was limited by the compromised ventilation system. Inside D block, the situation continued to deteriorate. The fire had reached cell 43 and cell 50. 10 cells were now involved in the blaze. The metal support structure of the tier was being tested by heat it was never designed to withstand. Steel beams expanded, rivets strained, and the entire 3rd tier began to exhibit signs of structural stress. Morrison's team had retreated to the 2nd tier landing, maintaining a presence in the block, but unable to proceed further without additional support. Through his thermal camera, Morrison watched the heat signatures in the 3rd tier cells. Some were moving, some were still, some were growing fainter by the minute. Cell 46 housed 2 inmates, Robert "Snake" Mendoza, a gang enforcer serving 25 years, and William Patterson, a white-collar criminal caught in a fraud scheme. The 2 men had nothing in common except their cell and their current predicament. Mendoza had spent the first 10 minutes of the fire screaming threats at the guards, at the system, at God himself. Patterson had spent that time praying quietly in the corner. Now, as the smoke reached critical levels, both men had run out of words. They sat together on the floor, backs against the wall, accepting that this was how their stories ended. The fire department's first priority was stopping the spread. 2 teams entered D block with charged hose lines, attacking the flames from below. The water turned to steam instantly in the superheated air, reducing visibility even further, but beginning the slow process of heat reduction. Chief Daniels coordinated from the entrance, radio chatter filling his ears as teams reported in. The thermal imaging revealed that approximately 40% of the 3rd tier inmates were no longer showing significant heat signatures. Either they'd succumbed to smoke inhalation or had found pockets of breathable air and reduced their movement to conserve oxygen. The remaining 60% were still fighting, still moving, still alive. Command to all teams, we're proceeding with door breaching on the 3rd tier. Prioritize cells showing active heat signatures. Use thermal guidance to identify viable rescues. Watch for structural instability. The hydraulic cutting equipment was brought to the 3rd tier landing. The tools were designed to cut through vehicle frames in traffic accidents. They'd work on cell doors, but slowly. Each door would take precious minutes to breach. The team selected cell 48 as their first target. The thermal imaging showed 2 inmates pressed against the door, clearly alive, clearly in distress. The cutter's jaws bit into the steel doorframe with a metallic shriek that echoed through the smoke-filled block. Inside cell 48, James Porter heard the sound of salvation. He pressed his face harder against the door window, trying to see his rescuers through the smoke. Next to him, Kevin Liu had given up hope an hour ago. Now it flooded back, dangerous and intoxicating. The cutting took 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which the fire continued its relentless consumption of everything burnable. 4 minutes during which other inmates in other cells listened to the sound of rescue and wondered if they'd be next, or if they'd die waiting. The door fell away. Firefighters grabbed Porter and Liu, pulling them from the cell into slightly less toxic air. Oxygen masks were pressed to their faces. They were carried down the stairs, 2 more lives saved. Cell 49 was next. The thermal imaging showed only one heat signature. The cutting began. 3 minutes this time. The team's efficiency improving with practice. The door opened to reveal both inmates on the floor. One, Craig Davidson, was unconscious but breathing. The other, Tommy Reyes, had stopped breathing entirely. The firefighters grabbed Davidson, performed a quick assessment on Reyes, confirmed the absence of pulse, and moved on. There were 22 more cells to breach on the 3rd tier. Hayes watched from the control room as the body count began. 1 confirmed dead. 3 in critical condition. The numbers would only get worse. His phone rang, the state corrections director. "Hayes, I'm seeing preliminary reports. Tell me this isn't as bad as it looks." "It's worse, sir. We have multiple fatalities confirmed, and the fire is still not fully contained. Electronic security systems failed catastrophically. Manual backups were compromised. We're breaching cells one at a time, but we're running out of time." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Warden, I need you to prepare for a full investigation. Every decision, every system failure, every maintenance report. The state police are already en route. This facility is now a crime scene." Crime scene. The word hit Hayes like a physical blow. This wasn't just a disaster. This was criminal negligence, deferred maintenance, budget cuts that prioritized optics over safety, and people had died because of it. "Understood, sir." Hayes hung up and returned his attention to the monitors. The fire was finally beginning to weaken under the assault of thousands of gallons of water. Steam filled the block, replacing smoke with a different kind of obscurity. Cell 47, where this entire catastrophe began, was being examined by arson investigators who'd arrived with the fire department. They worked carefully, documenting everything, photographing the sharpened metal still embedded in the electrical conduit, the deliberate nature of the act becoming obvious to anyone with training. Marcus Webb's body was located beneath the collapsed ceiling tiles. The medical examiner would later determine that smoke inhalation had claimed him before the flames did. A small mercy in a situation devoid of mercy. The breaching continued. Cell after cell revealed the same story. Inmates who'd fought to survive, who'd used every trick they knew to find breathable air, to protect themselves from the heat, to stay alive just 1 more minute. Some succeeded, some didn't. Cell 51 yielded Anthony Briggs, unconscious but alive, and Marcus Chen dead from smoke inhalation. Cell 53 contained 2 survivors. Cell 45, closest to the origin point, contained 2 bodies so badly burned that identification would require dental records. By the time the last cell was breached, the count stood at 11 dead, 17 critical, and 25 with serious injuries. 53 inmates had been locked in their cells when the fire started. Now ambulances lined up outside the facility, a convoy of flashing lights carrying the survivors to hospitals throughout the region. The media had arrived. News helicopters circled the facility. Reporters gathered at the gates, cameras rolling, capturing every vehicle that entered or exited. Hayes stood in the control room, watching the organized chaos below, knowing that his career was over. Knowing that every decision he'd made, every budget compromise he'd accepted, every maintenance delay he'd approved, had contributed to this outcome. Sergeant Reeves found him there, standing alone among the monitors and control panels. "Warden." Hayes turned. Reeves looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. His face was soot-stained, his eyes red from smoke exposure. "I failed them," Hayes said quietly. "Every single one of them. I failed." Reeves wanted to disagree, to offer comfort, to say something that would make the weight easier to bear, but he couldn't, because it was true. The investigation would take months. It would reveal a cascade of systemic failures, maintenance deferred, safety systems neglected, budget cuts prioritized, warnings ignored. It would reveal that Marcus Webb had spent weeks planning his attack, had identified every weakness in the system, had exploited failures that multiple reports had documented. But none of that mattered in this moment. In this moment, 11 men were dead. 17 were fighting for their lives. And a prison warden stood in his control room, watching his facility smolder, understanding that control had always been an illusion. The sun rose over Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary 6 hours after the fire began. The smoke had cleared enough to reveal the full extent of the damage. The third tier of D block was a blackened skeleton of twisted metal and scorched concrete. Water dripped from every surface, pooling on the lower tiers, mixing with ash and debris to create a toxic sludge that coated everything. Chief Daniels walked the third tier with his investigation team, documenting every detail. The heat had been so intense that the metal railings had warped. Support beams showed stress fractures. The entire structural integrity of the tier was compromised. D block would need to be completely rebuilt, assuming the facility remained operational at all. Hayes had been awake for 32 hours straight. He sat in his office, no longer the control room where he'd watched everything unfold, but his personal office where the walls were lined with commendations and photographs from a career that had just ended. The state police investigator sat across from him, recording every word. Detective Sarah Chen had worked institutional investigations for 12 years. She'd seen corruption, brutality, negligence in every form. This case was different. This wasn't one bad actor. This was systemic failure on every level. Warden Hayes, let's start with the maintenance records for D block, specifically the electrical systems and the electronic security doors. Hayes pulled a file from his desk drawer. It was thick with reports, requisitions, denials. He handed it to Chen without comment. She flipped through the pages, her expression darkening with each one she read. This report from 18 months ago recommends immediate electrical system replacement. It flags the exact conduit that failed as a critical safety hazard. Why wasn't this addressed? Budget constraints. The State Corrections Department denied our funding request. We were told to prioritize based on immediate operational needs. The electrical system was functioning, so it was deemed non-critical. Non-critical, Chen repeated, her voice flat. 11 people are dead because a system deemed non-critical failed catastrophically. Hayes had no response. The words were true. No justification existed that would make them less true. And the security door manual overrides systems. Multiple reports indicate they were tested and found to be corroded. Why weren't they replaced? Same answer. Budget denial. We were told to manage with existing systems. Chen closed the file. Warden, I need you to understand something. This investigation will determine whether criminal charges are filed. Negligent homicide, manslaughter. The state needs someone to hold accountable, and right now, you're in the crosshairs. Hayes met her eyes. I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you made a choice. You prioritized your operational record over inmate safety. You knew these systems were failing, and you did nothing. I filed reports. I requested funding. I followed proper channels. And when those channels failed, you did nothing else. You didn't refuse to operate the facility. You didn't go public with the safety concerns. You kept this place running and hoped nothing would go wrong. The truth of her words settled like lead in Hayes' stomach. She was right. He'd known the risks, he'd documented them, and then he'd done nothing but hope. Across town, Regional Medical Center was overwhelmed. 17 critical patients from the prison fire had flooded their emergency department and intensive care units. Every burn specialist within 100 miles had been called in. Every ventilator was in use. The hospital had activated its mass casualty protocols, transforming routine spaces into emergency treatment areas. Dr. Michael Torres, the trauma director, moved between patients with mechanical efficiency. Each one presented the same basic injuries: severe smoke inhalation, thermal burns, carbon monoxide poisoning. The treatments were straightforward. The outcomes were uncertain. Anthony Briggs lay in ICU bed 7, intubated and sedated. His lungs had been seared by superheated air. His survival depended on whether the tissue could heal or would scar into uselessness. The monitors showed his oxygen saturation hovering at 84% despite maximum ventilator support. In bed 12, James Porter was awake and terrified. He'd been lucky. Minor burns, moderate smoke inhalation. He'd survive with minimal long-term damage, but the psychological trauma was written across his face. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smoke, felt the heat, heard the screams of men dying in locked cells. A nurse approached his bed with medication. Porter grabbed her wrist, his grip desperate. The others. How many made it? The nurse's hesitation told him everything before she spoke. You should focus on your own recovery. How many? 28 were brought here. 11 were pronounced dead at the scene. The rest are at other hospitals. Porter released her wrist and turned his face away. 11 dead. Men he'd lived alongside, eaten meals with, shared the grinding monotony of prison life with, gone because someone had decided they were under control. Back at Coldridge, the investigation team had moved into cell 47. The arson investigators had already determined the fire's origin and method. Now they were trying to understand the why. Marcus Webb's cell had been stripped bare by the flames, but some items had survived. A metal box, fireproof, contained letters. The investigators carefully extracted each one, photographing them before reading. The letters told a story. Webb had been writing to his sister for 8 months. The correspondence started normal enough. Discussions of appeals, family news, the mundane details of staying connected across prison walls. Then the tone shifted. 3 months ago, Webb's sister had written to inform him that their mother had died. She'd been ill, but the prison medical system had denied Webb's request for compassionate release to see her one final time. The warden had personally denied the request, citing Webb's history of violence and the risk of flight. The letters after that were different. Webb's handwriting changed, becoming more controlled, more deliberate. He stopped asking for help with his appeal. He stopped discussing the future. His letters became philosophical reflections on control, on power, on what it meant to be trapped in a system that viewed you as less than human. The last letter, dated 1 week before the fire, contained a single line. Sometimes the only control we have is choosing how we lose it. Detective Chen read the letters in Hayes's office, with the warden sitting across from her. He planned this, Chen said. Every detail. He knew the electrical system was vulnerable because he'd been paying attention to the maintenance crews. He knew the security doors had manual override issues because he'd watched them fail during drills. He weaponized your facility's negligence. Hayes stared at the letters. He killed himself and 10 others to make a point. He killed himself and 10 others because he had nothing left to lose and wanted to ensure someone paid attention. Congratulations, Warden. The whole state is paying attention now. The media coverage was relentless. Every news outlet ran the story. Video footage of the fire, interviews with families of the dead, expert commentary on prison safety standards. Coldridge became a symbol of everything wrong with the correction system. Protesters gathered outside the state capitol, demanding reform, demanding accountability, demanding that the people responsible face justice. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from budget decisions they'd made. Corrections officials released carefully worded statements about commitment to safety, while quietly destroying documents that might prove damaging. The families of the dead began arriving at Coldridge, demanding answers, demanding to see where their sons and brothers and fathers had died. The facility set up a family assistance center in the administration building, staffed by counselors and victim advocates who had the impossible job of explaining how 11 men had burned to death in a modern correctional facility. Maria Gonzalez sat in the assistance center holding a photograph of her son. Carlos had been 26 years old, serving 8 years for drug possession. He'd been trying to turn his life around, taking correspondence courses, staying out of trouble. Now he was gone, suffocated by smoke, while locked in a cell he couldn't escape. They told me he was under control, Maria said to the counselor sitting with her. When Carlos got in trouble, when he fought with other inmates, they always said they had it under control. They didn't have anything under control. The counselor had no response that would matter. No words could bring Carlos back or make his death mean something beyond the statistics. Similar scenes played out across the center. 11 families. 11 variations of the same impossible grief. They'd known their loved ones were in prison, had accepted that reality with all its hardships, but they'd never imagined this, never imagined that the state itself would fail so completely to protect the people in its custody. Sergeant Reeves had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He sat in his apartment, unable to sleep, unable to stop replaying the events in his mind. Every decision analyzed, every action questioned. Should he have recognized Webb's behavior as more than standard non-compliance? Should he have insisted on waiting for backup before opening the cell? Should he have done something, anything different? His phone rang constantly. Media requests, calls from other corrections officers, messages from friends offering support. He ignored them all except one. Officer Martinez called, her voice small and broken. I can't stop seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that cell. I see him standing there with his arms out like he was welcoming it. Reeves understood. The image was burned into his mind too. Webb, standing in flames, accepting his fate with something that looked like peace. "We did what we were trained to do," Reeves said, though the words felt hollow. "We followed procedure. The procedures were broken. The whole system was broken. We were just following orders in a broken system, and people died because of it." She was right. They'd been operating within a framework designed by people who prioritized cost savings over safety, efficiency over humanity. They'd trusted that the people making decisions at higher levels knew what they were doing. That trust had been betrayed. 3 days after the fire, the state announced a complete review of all correctional facilities. Every prison would undergo immediate safety inspections. Any facility with critical deficiencies would be shut down until repairs were completed. The announcement came with a price tag in the hundreds of millions, money that would have to be found somewhere in an already strained budget. Coldridge was the first facility on the inspection list. The team arrived with checklists and authority to shut down operations immediately if conditions warranted. They found exactly what they expected: decades of deferred maintenance, safety systems that existed on paper but not in practice, a facility that had been allowed to decay while maintaining the appearance of functionality. The inspection report ran to 300 pages. The conclusion was simple: Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary was unfit for continued operation. The facility would be closed. All inmates would be transferred to other institutions. All staff would be reassigned or terminated. Hayes received the news in his office, delivered by the state corrections director himself, the man who'd approved every budget denial, who'd prioritized political optics over operational reality, now sat across from Hayes and delivered the death sentence for his facility. "This isn't personal, Warden. The state needs to demonstrate that we're taking action." Coldridge becomes the example. The example of what? Your own failed policies? The director's expression hardened. "Watch yourself, Hayes. You're already facing criminal investigation. Don't make this worse. Worse than 11 people dead. Worse than a facility we both knew was failing but kept running anyway. How exactly do I make this worse?" The director stood. "By forgetting that you were the warden. You were responsible. The buck stopped with you, and you failed. Own that, because nobody else is going to." He left Hayes sitting alone in an office that would soon belong to someone else, in a facility that would soon be empty, carrying the weight of responsibility for a disaster that had 1,000 fathers but would be blamed on one man. The inmate transfers began 2 weeks after the fire. Buses lined up outside Coldridge, transporting prisoners to facilities across the state. The men of D Block, those who'd survived, were split up, scattered to different institutions. The administration claimed it was for logistical reasons. Everyone knew it was to prevent them from talking to each other, from organizing any kind of collective response to what they'd experienced. Raymond Costa, Webb's cellmate who'd survived by being evacuated before the worst of the fire, found himself transferred to a facility 6 hours away. He carried with him the memory of Webb's final words, spoken just before he'd driven the shank into the electrical conduit. "Tell them I wasn't under control. Tell them none of us were ever under control." Costa would spend the rest of his sentence trying to figure out if Webb was a martyr or a murderer, a man who'd made a statement, or a man who'd committed an act of terrorism. The answer probably lay somewhere in between, in that grey space where desperation and rage and the desire to be seen as human all mixed together into something that could only end in fire. The criminal investigation concluded 4 months after the fire. The district attorney held a press conference to announce the findings. Detective Chen stood behind him, her face carefully neutral, as he delivered the verdict the state had decided upon. "After extensive investigation, we have determined that while systemic failures contributed to the tragedy at Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary, criminal charges are not warranted against any individual. The fire was deliberately set by inmate Marcus Webb in an act of planned destruction. The failures of safety systems, while deeply concerning, do not rise to the level of criminal negligence." The families of the dead sat in the audience, their faces showing the rage and betrayal they felt. No one would be held accountable. No one would go to prison for the deaths of their loved ones. The system had investigated itself and found itself blameless. Maria Gonzalez stood up during the question period. "My son died locked in a cage. You knew the cages were broken. You knew people could die. And you're telling me nobody is responsible." The district attorney offered the practiced sympathy of a politician who knew his words would change nothing. "Ma'am, I understand your pain, But the law requires us to prove criminal intent. We found negligence, not intent. Civil remedies may still be available to the families. Civil remedies, lawsuits that would take years to resolve, settlements that would be paid by taxpayers, money that would never bring back the dead or make the system safer. Warden Mitchell Hayes was fired 3 days after the announcement. His pension was revoked. His law enforcement credentials were permanently suspended. He would never work in corrections again. The state needed a scapegoat, and he'd been selected for the role. He cleaned out his office alone, packing away the commendations and photographs, the evidence of a career that had ended in spectacular failure. Sergeant Reeves found him there. 2 men who'd spent years working together, now both facing uncertain futures. "I'm sorry," Reeves said. Hayes shook his head. "Don't be. We both knew things were broken. We both kept our heads down and did our jobs, and hoped someone else would fix it. This is what happens when everybody assumes someone else is responsible. What will you do now?" "I don't know. Find some other way to make a living. Try to figure out how to live with this." Reeves helped him carry boxes to his car. They shook hands in the parking lot, a gesture that felt inadequate for everything they'd been through together. Then Hayes drove away from Coldridge for the last time, watching the facility shrink in his rearview mirror until it disappeared. The facility itself was demolished 8 months later. The state determined that rebuilding would cost more than constructing a new prison elsewhere. The demolition crews brought in heavy equipment and systematically tore down the walls, the cell blocks, the control rooms. D block came down last, that charred testament to failure, reduced to rubble and loaded into trucks. Local residents gathered to watch the demolition. Some came out of curiosity, others came because they'd worked at the prison, had family who'd worked there, had built their lives around an institution that had defined their community for 50 years. They watched in silence as the wrecking balls swung and the walls came down. Within a year, the site was cleared and sold to a developer who planned to build a shopping center. Nothing would remain to indicate that Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary had ever existed, except in the memories of those who'd lived through its final days. Officer Lisa Martinez never returned to corrections work. She took a job as a school security officer, work that let her help protect people without the weight of cages and locks and systems designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She still had nightmares about the smoke, but they grew less frequent over time. Officer Derek Thompson transferred to a minimum security facility in another state. He told himself he was starting fresh, but he carried Coldridge with him. Every time he walked a tier, every time he conducted a head count, he saw the faces of the men who'd died. He worked his shifts with meticulous attention to detail, checking and double-checking every lock, every system, every protocol. His colleagues thought he was paranoid. He knew he was traumatized. Sergeant Paul Reeves left law enforcement entirely. He went back to school, earned a degree in social work, and began working with prison reform organizations. He testified before legislative committees about the realities of institutional failures, about how good people working in broken systems enabled tragedy. He became one of the loudest voices demanding change, driven by guilt and by the belief that the 11 men who died in D Block deserved better than to be forgotten. The survivors scattered across the correctional system carried their own trauma. Some, like James Porter, used the experience as motivation to turn their lives around. Porter completed his sentence, got released, and became an advocate for prison safety reform. He told his story to anyone who would listen, keeping the memory of that night alive. Others, like Anthony Briggs, were broken by it. Briggs survived his injuries, but never recovered psychologically. He became withdrawn, paranoid, unable to function in the general population. He spent the remainder of his sentence in protective custody, a man whose spirit had been extinguished by smoke and fear. The lawsuits filed by the families of the dead were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The state admitted no wrongdoing as part of the settlement agreements. The money was distributed to the families with the requirement that they sign non-disclosure agreements. The state bought their silence, ensuring that the details of the failures would remain buried in legal documents most people would never read. Maria Gonzalez took her settlement and established a foundation in her son's name, dedicated to prison reform and inmate safety. She couldn't bring Carlos back, but she could fight to prevent other mothers from experiencing the same loss. She became a voice for the voiceless, a reminder that the people locked behind prison walls were still people, still someone's son or daughter or parent. The reforms promised in the wake of the Coldridge fire were implemented slowly, if at all. Safety inspections became more frequent for a year, then gradually returned to previous patterns. Maintenance budgets increased slightly, then were cut again when budget pressures mounted. The politicians who'd promised change moved on to other issues. The media found new tragedies to cover. 5 years after the fire, a corrections officer at a facility 3 states away filed a maintenance request about faulty electrical systems in one of the cell blocks. The request was denied due to budget constraints. The officer filed another request. It was denied again. He considered going public, making noise, forcing someone to pay attention. Then he remembered that such actions typically resulted in termination, not change. He filed the paperwork, documented the hazards, and hoped nothing would go wrong. Because that's what people in broken systems do. They document, they report, they follow proper channels, and they hope that someone else will take responsibility for fixing what's broken. The electrical system in that facility would fail 18 months later, though not catastrophically. Just a power outage that lasted 6 hours, leaving inmates locked in their cells in total darkness. Nobody died. It was considered a minor incident, barely worth mentioning in the facility's annual report. The memory of Coldridge faded from public consciousness. The families of the dead remembered. The survivors remembered. The officers who'd been there remembered. But the broader world moved on, as it always does, until the next tragedy demands attention and outrage, and promises of reform that will be forgotten as soon as the cameras look away. In a storage facility somewhere in Pennsylvania, boxes containing the investigation files from the Coldridge fire sit on shelves, gathering dust. Hundreds of pages of testimony, maintenance records, safety reports, photographs of the destruction, evidence of a system that failed, of decisions that prioritized cost over lives, of good people trapped in bad systems, making choices that seemed reasonable until they resulted in catastrophe. Those files will remain sealed for 50 years per state law. By the time anyone can legally access them, everyone involved will be dead or too old to care. The lessons learned will be forgotten. The reforms will have been rolled back. And somewhere in some facility, another warden will deny another maintenance request because the budget doesn't allow for it, because the system is functioning well enough, because nothing has gone wrong yet. The story of Coldridge Maximum Security Penitentiary ends not with justice or closure, but with the slow entropy of institutional memory. The facility is gone. The dead are buried. The survivors are scattered. And the systems that enabled the tragedy continue to operate, largely unchanged, waiting for the next Marcus Webb to find the next vulnerability and light the next fire. Because that's what happens when everyone assumes someone else is responsible. When accountability is diffused across so many people that no one person can be held to account. When the complexity of bureaucracy provides cover for negligence. When the public demands prisons remain out of sight and out of mind until something forces them to pay attention. Warden Mitchell Hayes died 7 years after the fire, his heart giving out at 59 years old. His obituary made no mention of Coldridge. His family buried him quietly, grateful that the scandal had finally receded enough that they could grieve without reporters asking for comments. At his funeral, Sergeant Reeves stood apart from the other mourners, watching as they lowered the casket into the ground. He thought about control, about how Hayes had believed he had it right up until the moment he didn't, how they'd all believed the systems they worked in were fundamentally sound, just in need of minor adjustments. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The systems were broken by design, built on compromises and cost savings, and the assumption that inmates were less deserving of safety than free citizens. Those systems had worked exactly as they were designed to work, right up until the moment they catastrophically failed, and they would fail again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but eventually, inevitably, because broken systems don't fix themselves. They limp along, held together by the dedication of people who work within them, until something pushes them past their breaking point. During the headcount, the warden said he was under control. 10 minutes later, the entire cell block was on fire. Those words would be etched into Reeves's memory for the rest of his life, a reminder that control is always an illusion, that safety is never guaranteed, and that the price of negligence is always paid by someone, usually by the people with the least power to protect themselves. The sun set over the empty lot where Coldridge once stood. Shopping carts rattled across pavement that had been laid over the rubble of cell blocks. Children played in areas that had once held men in cages. Life moved on as it always does, building new things on the ruins of old failures. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, some of the older residents swore they could still smell smoke.